Getting started. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Megan Wills, and I'm Director of Strategic Initiatives at Advanced CTE. I will be moderating today's Summer Learning Series session, and I'm very excited about this conversation. We have some really great experts joining us today. So today's session will provide an overview of the upcoming 2020 elections at both the federal and the state levels. And we'll also have some discussion about how the results of those elections may impact the field of career technical education. Obviously, I don't have to reinforce to anyone that 2020 is a really big year for elections with a lot at stake. So at the federal level, obviously there's an election for president, along with elections for all of the seats in the House and 35 seats in the Senate. At the state level, 11 states and 2 territories have elections for governor, and 44 states have elections for one or both chambers of the state legislature. Certainly the results of all of these elections have the potential for a major impact on public policy, and that's really what we're going to dig in on today. So again, I'm very excited to be joined today by 3 true experts in elections, and they will be spending the next hour with us to present an overview, a preview of the elections, and again, how those elections may impact public policy. I will start off by quickly introducing our speakers, and then we will turn it over to them and dig right in on content. So John Colbert is joining us. John is co-founder and partner at Capitol Hill Partners. John, if you can wave, where he provides lobbying and strategic assistance to clients in the areas of education and workforce development. Before he joined Capitol Hill Partners, John served as Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration and served in various other roles in the executive branch and working with Congress. Also really pleased to be joined by Jessica Taylor. Jessica, if you can wave. Jessica is the Senate and Governor's Editor for the Cook Political Report. Before joining Cook, Jessica was a political reporter for National Public Radio for 5 years. And while she was there, she covered elections and breaking news ranging from the White House to both chambers of Congress and statewide elections. And our third speaker is Wendy Underhill. Wendy is a program manager with the Legislative Management Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Wendy has been with NCSL for 4 years, and she specializes in research and analysis on elections issues, including online voter registration, voter ID, voting technology, early voting, election metrics, and more. Again, just so thankful that all 3 of these experts have joined us today. So on our webinar today, John, Jessica, and Wendy will each give a brief presentation, and they'll really provide a preview of the 2020 elections from each of their perspectives. I will lead us in a short moderated discussion among the 3 speakers, and we will definitely save time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please, throughout the webinar, if you have questions as our 3 speakers are talking, feel free to enter those questions in the chat box, and we will, I'll read those out at the end of the webinar as we have time for some questions. So that is the end of my housekeeping and introductions. So as I said, we will get right to the content. So our first speaker today is John Colbert. John will provide a preview of the presidential and House elections. So John, take it away.
Oh, thank you very much, Megan. I'll share my screen and we'll get started. So here we are. As Megan said, I was going to cover the House and the presidential races over the course of the next 10 minutes. And I'll be throwing a lot of information at you and certainly have questions at the end. But really, I think for all 3 of us as speakers, we want to leave you better informed than you came here today. So when it comes to the presidential race, there's 2 different strategies at hand. We're seeing from the president making the election a choice between himself and Joe Biden, rather than just a referendum on himself and the economy and the pandemic, et cetera. And he's really trying to rally his base, sometimes in rather harsh language or tones, but he's trying to get what he would call his voters out, and at the same time discouraging others from voting. So reducing the overall size of the pool, but trying to get his voters out, which is in direct contrast to what Vice President Biden is trying to do, making it a referendum about the president, make the election about the president, which is why his low-key strategy, rolling out policy initiatives rather than large-scale, high-profile rallies, virtual rallies, seems to be working, at least in the polls, as well as get those folks who are disenchanted with the president's policies outside their Democratic base. We've seen 4 separate groups of Republicans against the president who have been rallying in support of the VP, and Democrat and independents have also been trending towards Vice President Biden. When it comes down to this election, the national polls really don't matter. It's all about the 6 key battleground states and getting your voters out to the polls, whether it's in person or through absentee balloting, despite the recent controversy over this issue, which hadn't been so in the past. And if you look at where the president is versus those 2-term presidents, he's vastly behind. He's currently right around 40% in the Real Clear Politics indicators. So he's challenged there, but he's right in between the last 2 one-term presidents. So looking at this historically, he certainly has a chance to rebound. But the challenge for him is that when you look at those red bars, those are strongly opposing the president. These come from earlier this summer. And what we're seeing is when you're in the 40s plus to nearly 50% of strongly disapproving or disapproving, it's really hard with less than 100 days to get a portion of those voters back. The good news for the president is his voters are thrilled to be able to vote for him. And one challenge for Democrats and Vice President Biden in particular is there's not so much enthusiasm about the VP, Vice President Biden, so much as there is voting against the president. But that glimmer of hope for the president is actually not as appealing as first blush. When you look according to Gallup, just since the beginning of the year, self-identified Republicans have gone down 8% nationally to its lowest level since 1974, as opposed to Democrats gaining 3%. But that's an extraordinary drop in a little bit of time. And as a result, and looking at Jessica's colleagues at the Cook Report, their analysis is that Vice President Biden has a narrow cushion right now if the election was held today, with 308 electoral college votes. And that doesn't even account for some of the toss-ups, such as Arizona, where Vice President Biden is ahead, and North Carolina, which is very competitive at this moment in time. So it's an uphill battle across the board right now for President Trump. And the shrinking number of toss-up votes is actually adding to this challenge. As you can see there are only 3 states that are considered toss-ups, and Arizona has certainly been trending towards the VP, Vice President Biden at the moment. And the reason why this is so crucial is the president in 2016 won by such a narrow margin. Winning 10 states by 5 points or less doesn't allow you a lot of wiggle room. And that wiggle room seems to be going away on a weekly basis here. But for the president, there is some interesting correlation between where Secretary Clinton was in battlegrounds versus where Vice President Biden is today. And we can see, if you look at those 2 highlighted columns, the president won all 6 states in 2016. And VP Biden has a narrow margin above Secretary Clinton in most of these states. He's doing a bit better, but I would hardly call that a landslide. And these are the states that truly matter at the end of the day. The challenge for the president is that since Inauguration Day, where he his net approval looked quite good in these states, it has drastically gone down to double digits in each of these battlegrounds. So not a good trend for supporters of the president at this moment in time. And when you're looking at what is the president's strategy, and it's about trying to get non-college white voters back to the polls, particularly those in the battleground states who didn't vote last time. You can see it's a considerable number and dwarfs the number of college white voters who are trending now towards Biden. So that is where the president is focused. And if he can get a significant portion of these voters to the polls and voting for him, he's got a better chance than it looks right at this moment in time. However, in comparison to Secretary Clinton, with key voting blocks nationally, Biden is doing better, particularly with older voters who've been turned off by the president's response to the pandemic, and independents who are now leaning in Biden's direction as well. The biggest difference we've really seen is amongst white voters, particularly that swing to college-educated voters, moving strongly in support of Biden's candidacy. And non-college whites are still in Trump's corner, but not to the extent they were. And that is a significant reason why Biden is ahead in these states and nationally. So that's a quick primer on where we are related to the presidential race. On that, when it comes to the House elections, it's a little more settled. Republicans need 17 seats to recapture the majority, and right now, if you look at the generic congressional ballot, where a voter is asked, would you vote for the unnamed Democrat or Republican? Democrats are doing pretty well. Those aren't tsunami levels, but they are very strong supportive levels for Democrats adding seats this cycle. And Jessica's publication has also moved 20 House races incrementally towards Democrats over the course of the past month. And these elections tend to go one direction. They don't usually zigzag quite so much as we get closer and closer to early November. For targets related to the two parties, Democrats have what they call a red to blue campaign. And so there are 19 seats held by currently Republicans that they are hoping to turn. And Republicans are really looking at those districts that the president won, and there's still a Democrat at the House level. So that's their big picture focus. But when you get down to it, there are really only 25 seats in close play, 15 of which are held by Democrats. No surprise, they had a terrific election in 2018. You expect that they would have more seats that would be vulnerable, but it is not a significant number that it's more vulnerable in this particular cycle. And as a result, there's more, at this point, a narrow congressional majority for the Democrats before you even look to those 25 toss-up races. And it's why you hear prognosticators saying that the House is likely to stay in Democratic hands. So why is this happening? You would think that after a significant pickup by Democrats that Republicans would be able to recapture some of these seats, as opposed to what we're looking at right now is a potential 5 or 10 seat increase in Democratic seats today. We'll see where we are moving forward. It's mainly because Republican members are retiring. Ask any member who has been a chair or a senior member in the majority. If you're in the House minority, it stinks. It's the worst. You lose every amendment. You lose the votes on the floor. It's a depressing place to be in the minority. And so you're seeing this high turnover, as well as in comparison to the Democrats who are holding on to their seats with only 9 retirements at this moment in time. And there's a brain drain as well on both sides of the Hill for leading Republicans, losing 8 chairs or ranking members, their lead Republican members of these committees. And that's tough to replace at this moment in time. So it has the potential of being a minor wave in support of the Ds, and it's in large part because of the reasons we looked at, as well as the president's sliding popularity. Even if President Trump is elected to a second term, historically, that party in power in the Congress only picks up a handful of seats, so it doesn't bode well regardless of the scenario. And there's beginning to be the sentiment that a Biden win could, in fact, bring coattails to Congress in an all-Democratic Washington for at least 2 years. So that's where we are right at this moment in time, and I'd be happy to turn it over to my fellow panelists. Well, I'll turn it back to you, Megan. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing right now.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for sharing that great overview. You certainly covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. So we will definitely have some follow-up conversation and especially talk about the impact of the elections and all of these potential changes on the world of education and training policy. We'll dig into that a little bit more in our discussion among the panelists a little bit later on. We'll continue on with kind of setting the stage, laying some of the foundation for that conversation by turning it over to our next presenter, Jessica Taylor. Jessica will give a preview and overview of the Senate races and the governor's races. So Jessica, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you all. I'm gonna share my screen here too, and let me know if you all have any issues seeing it. And John, I appreciate you using some of our numbers there at the from Cook. And as he showed you that, certainly we see the presidential election very much as leaning toward Biden at this point. And I recently moved quite a few races in this for the Senate as well. And at this point, if things sort of stay where they are with the presidential numbers, especially, and that is having a down ballot drag on a lot of these Republican incumbents. So let me go over first what it would take to flip the Senate and kind of spell out where we currently see the map. So as of now, Democrats need to flip 3 seats if they win the White House, because of course the vice president would act as a tiebreaker 4 seats without winning the presidency. However, as I will show the map in a minute, when I am thinking about this, I am thinking about actually the most vulnerable incumbent is not a Republican at this point. I believe that it is a Democrat, Doug Jones, who won that special election in 2017, and he is not going to face Roy Moore, who was the very controversial, had sexual misconduct allegations made against him. He's now going to be facing off against former Auburn head football coach Tommy Tuberville. It's a race that we continue to watch, but it's one that we rate at this point as lean Republican, because this is going to be presidential turnout in a state like Alabama that President Trump won handily. So most people that I talk to, Republicans and Democrats and myself, when we are thinking about what it would take, I'm already sort of adding in that 1 net loss. So that would leave Democrats then needing 4 seats to flip control if Biden wins, or 5 without. And I think that it is a very doable path to getting those 4 or 5. I'm not sure that it seems unlikely that we would see a Democratic Senate without a Democratic president at this point, but so those 4 are very doable. And we currently estimate Democratic Senate gains to be anywhere between 2 to 7 seats. And virtually all of the Republican spending at this point is being spent on defense, whereas Democrats are going on offense against a lot of these incumbents. And I think that the Senate is going to be more into focus. We are now, I believe, 97 days out from the election. And if we are taking into account, as John outlined, that we see all of these factors leaning toward Trump losing and Biden winning, and Democrats very likely to hold the House, if not possibly add seats, this leaves the Republican-controlled Senate as sort of Republicans' last firewall to sort of, that it would sort of be able to block, many things that a President Biden would want to do, versus if you had essentially both houses of Congress and the White House in Democratic-controlled hands, you could see a lot of things get passed that are Democratic priorities that have been sort of stymied over the past 4 years, especially. And so again, as of even just last week, I moved sort of our ratings from a sort of 50-50 chance back in March when I last looked at it overall to now a slight chance. And that is largely because Democrats started off with a much more favorable map. They were defending just 12 seats compared to 23 for the Republicans. And if you think back to 2018, this was virtually the opposite. Of course, as Democrats flipped the House, because of the way the map was, where it was Democrats largely on defense, especially in some very Republican very, very red states, like Indiana and Missouri and North Dakota, that just made it much more difficult. That sort of wave election was somewhat inoculated and muted at the Senate level because of that cycle of senators that were up. Those were senators that had won in 2012, riding Obama's coattails. But then this cycle of senators, this sort of class 2 of senators, they were elected in 2014. And so that was a very Republican year, the last time Republicans took back the Senate. So now they're facing very different sort of headwinds against them than they were 6 years ago. And a lot of these are most of them are freshmen running in their first race, and they may not have had as difficult of a challenger, or certainly were aided by that environment. And I think the other thing adding to this is that Democrats have successfully expanded the map, and I'll show you in just a minute sort of where we have seen shifts over the past 6-7 months. But even when this cycle began, we actually didn't have a single incumbent in toss-up. Now we see 7 Republican senators in a very in our toss-up category or worse. And And then we have two other Republican-held seats that are currently in our lean Republican column, Kansas and the Georgia special, and then that Democratic seat in Alabama that I mentioned. But then, of course, sort of this is where expanding the map takes on, is that we consider these likely Republican at this point, but that means that we are sort of monitoring them and watching them. There are some either state changes at play, such as in Texas, demographic shifts and political shifts that we see there as the presidential race is very tight in a state that we have long been watching for a long time for changing, or unusually strong in challengers or raising a lot of money, and that would be the case in Kentucky, South Carolina, and Alaska as well. So here is sort of where we began 2020. I would point here to Montana is another one where strong Democratic recruiting has now made this a toss-up after they successfully recruited Democratic Governor Steve Bullock to run there. Steve Daines was considered very safe until that point. We have seen North Carolina shift from lean Republican to a toss-up. We have seen Arizona shift from a toss-up to now lean Democratic. South Carolina moving, a Georgia seat moving. I think we have Alabama here, the only seat that we have moved toward Republicans at that point. Iowa, again, started the year likely a Republican. Now it is firmly in the toss-up category. And then we also have Alaska over here, solid Republican. We have moved that to likely Republican. So here's sort of the big picture map of where we see things. And you can see here just how many Republicans are here, in our, in our competitive categories versus, again, here in Alabama, we have Doug Jones. And really the only potential other sort of offensive opportunity for Republicans at this point is in Michigan. Gary Peters, he has been outraised for the past several quarters by John James, who ran in 2018. He's a former Army pilot, African-American Republican running. But again, I think Michigan is a state that we increasingly see as very difficult for President Trump when you look at his numbers there. And I'll explain later sort of how difficult it is for some of these incumbents to run ahead of the president necessarily. We've actually moved these other two races now to solid D. I apologize, that's a little mistake there from Kept Over. But again, these were two sort of expansion states, that Minnesota and New Mexico, that even the Trump campaign had talked about at one point, wanting to make sort of offense, because in Minnesota they only lost it by a few last time, and so we saw Republicans really sort of wanting to make offensive opportunities here, but I think I now see those as off the table, solid Democrats. So I think, again, focus on sort of these races here. This, I think, is where the Senate battleground is going to be won or lost. Colorado with Cory Gardner. He is probably the most vulnerable incumbent in this one, and he very well could end up in lean Democratic at some point soon. I think Purdue, I just moved from lean Republican to toss up, and that's largely a function of just how competitive Georgia has become at the presidential race. Sort of the same thing with Joni Ernst. She won in 2014, was seen as sort of a rising star. She had that memorable ad that you may remember, the make 'em squeal ad, but she finds herself very much on the defensive this time. Susan Collins is the only one in this category that is not a first-term incumbent, and she has regularly outperformed Republican presidents at the top of the ticket by around 20 points, but she's never had this competitive of an environment, this competitive of a challenge this time, with just millions of dollars being spent against her. And I'll show you some of the fundraising numbers here in just a minute. I mentioned sort of Montana there, Steve Daines. I think that's an interesting test case to watch, because this is the state that, when we look at the presidential numbers, that Republicans had the most comfortable victory. Trump did in 2016 rather, by 20 points. But we have also moved this race to likely Republican in our electoral ratings as well, because we see a tightening race even there. And then North Carolina, I think, is just going to be a very even battlefield, sort of ground zero, because you have a competitive Senate race there, of course, a very, very key presidential state, and then a competitive governor's race too, one of the few this cycle. This Georgia seat here, and then Kansas as well, and I'll sort of tick through some of those in the next slide here. So you can see this here on the map of sort of where this competitive battlefield, these are sort of the key states to watch as we try to determine which party takes the Senate. And sort of this, here's the breakdown of numbers of why some of these senators are in, I think, such dire straits. Here you have Maine, Susan Collins. Again, Trump lost this state by 3 points. Again, Cory Gardner is in the most competitive state when we look at the 2016 numbers by 5 points. He is running against, oh, excuse me there. That's my reminder to stand up, but I'm not going to do that right now. He's running, I think he certainly has the potential to run ahead of Trump in the state. He's running against former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper, who Democrats wooed into the race after another sort of exotic, presidential run that didn't end very well for him as he was campaigning as more of a moderate. Hickenlooper is very popular in the state after 2 terms, but he's had some missteps over some ethics charges, ethics violations, has not been a great candidate sort of out there. So that's one reason we have sort of kept this race there. But if the polling sort of stays where it is at this point and Trump is on pace to lose this, I think by sort of low double digits, sort of low teens at this point, 12, 13 points, I think the max sort of Gardner can outperform the president is maybe 5 points. And that is just really, really hard to do with the top of the ticket. And then of course, Collins there, she, like I said, her previous election, she has run very much ahead of Republican presidential nominees, even as they would lose the state. But this time she faces State House Speaker Sarah Gideon, who has just been raising her by almost 3-to-1, 2-to-1 in quarters. And Collins, I think, typifies more than any other candidate incumbent up this cycle, just how much the Republican Party has changed over the past 4 years. Really, even, you can go back to Tea Party days, certainly in 2010, but that she had to worry about a primary challenge, so she couldn't sort of, move very much to the center as she is more comfortable with. That sort of the Governor Paul LePage was breathing down her neck there, and so she voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. That just angered activists, certainly outside and inside the state. They actually raised a fund that Gideon got shortly after she was nominated of about $4 million to add to her already impressive total there. And she really finds herself in, I think, a very difficult position. Again, she voted to acquit President Trump in the impeachment trial. She had that sort of line that I think you will hear, and we've already heard in ads, we will continue to hear in ads, about she felt President Trump had learned his lesson. And I think one strategist put it to me, it's not that they're sort of disappointed in her, it sort of has come into an anger really at this point. So then these other states that are just sort of more marginal here, let's see here, why is this not, there we go. That we're single digit Trump states that we have seen tightening as we see sort of everywhere on the map. Iowa there, you can see Trump won the state by about 9.5 points. We have 2 Georgia seats up now, of course, because Johnny Isakson stepped down last year. Kelly Loeffler was appointed to that seat. And that's sort of an interesting scenario because it's not a traditional election. Because it is a special election, there will be a jungle primary, which all candidates, regardless of party, will run on the November ballot. And she's facing a challenge from her right, and Congressman Doug Collins, who was ranking member on the Judiciary Committee, a very vocal supporter of President Trump and opponent during the impeachment hearings. And Loeffler very much, I think, faces, she was appointed there sort of over the objections of some Trump, some Trump opponent wanting Collins to be there. But she's had to move to the right. Democrats have yet to sort of overall consolidate against the candidate. The leading candidate there is the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Raphael Warnock, which is the historically Black church that Martin Luther King Jr. preached at. John Lewis's funeral is being held there. And then you have Tom Tillis, again, a very close election there, I think, with former state senator Cal Cunningham. And then I actually view Martha McSally as the most endangered incumbent at this point, and I think it is because she, again, was appointed to this seat. John Kyle stepped into the seat temporarily, the former senator, after John McCain died. And she actually lost a race in 2018 to Kirsten Sinema. Her negatives just remain incredibly high. She hasn't done a lot to correct that. And she is running against who I think is, even Republicans will admit, is Democrats' best recruit this cycle, and former astronaut Mark Kelly. He's also married to Gabrielle Giffords. I'm just going to zoom through a few of this because I know I know we need to do this. So another sort of question that I will be watching is how much, again, I mentioned sort of in Colorado, how much Republican senators can outperform President Trump. And I think a key thing to look at is that in 2016, every single state that was flipped by either party went the same way. Every single Senate election went the same way as the presidential election. If that trend holds for 2020, we would see Republicans lose seats in Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and North Carolina, possibly Iowa and Georgia, and that alone would be enough to give them a majority. Now, that could, of course, make Montana a little more difficult, but we also see that Republicans in competitive elections perform closest to the presidential margin, whereas Democrats in some cases can perform closer to it. Just a quick look here, you can see just how much spending overall, and I mentioned that sort of offensive and defensive spending here. 97.4% of Democratic spending at this point is offensive, 96.6% is defensive. These are some of the outside super PAC spending. North Carolina is the top by far, followed by Iowa, and then Maine, Montana, and Georgia is moving up there as well. You can just see sort of the fundraising deficits here and these possible expansion states. I'll just give a very 1 minute sort of quick view over the governor's races, which there aren't that many this cycle. Typically they are up more in midterm cycles. Roy Cooper, governors are having a moment right now because they have, in contrast to the White House under President Trump, largely handled the coronavirus crisis very well. And you see Roy Cooper there, a Democrat in North Carolina. He's running ahead of where Democratic candidates are, both Biden and Cunningham there. This open seat is the only true toss-up that we see, with Bullitt being term limited and running for the Senate. You have Congressman Greg Gianforte running there against Lieutenant Governor. He's a Republican, against Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney, who's a Democrat. Again, I think that one will be very close. And then I think I'll just circle here these races to watch. New Hampshire and Vermont, two states that are very Democratic typically, especially Vermont. But you have these, this is where sort of these New England Republicans have been able to thrive. Sununu, Chris Sununu in New Hampshire and Phil Scott in Vermont have gotten very, very high marks for their handling of coronavirus. I think they're virtually a lock for re-election at this point. And of course, those are the only two states that actually elect their governors every 2 years instead of 4 years. I would watch this Missouri race a little bit. Mike Parson came into office after the former governor was indicted and stepped down. So he's sort of running for his first full term. He's running against the state auditor there, Nicole Galloway. He has gotten some criticism for how he has handled the coronavirus crisis, was sort of slow to respond and implement closings and masks and things like that. So that's one that could become more competitive. I apologize there for going a little bit over time.
No problem. Again, so much content to cover. Thank you so much, Jessica. So our final presenter today is Wendy Underhill. Wendy will give us a preview of the state legislative elections, and then we will move into some discussion. So I will pull up Wendy's slides. Give me just a moment here.
And let me just say thank you, Megan, very much for inviting me to do this. I have to admit that when you asked me to do this, I literally did not know what CTE meant. And so I went to my colleague at NCSL, Michelle Ekstrom. Maybe some of you know Michelle. She's deep in on this. And when she told me about it, I was like, oh, I'm so excited I get to do this. So if it's all right with you, I'm going to talk fast and I'm going to go through the slides fast so I can get to the part where we learn about what does this mean for CTE. So bear with me, here we go. All right, let's go to the next slide. I work for the National Conference of State Legislatures. I can't possibly go anywhere without telling you who we are. We support the work of legislators throughout the nation, and we provide, our structure is bipartisan, and our information that we provide is all nonpartisan. And it is possible that you guys connect with us quite a lot on the work that we've got up on the education side. I am on the election side. So if you want to know about online voter registration or you want to know about election security, happy to talk. But today, let's just talk politics just a little bit. Let's go ahead to the next slide. What strikes me about this year is that we are going to have a novel election because we've had a novel coronavirus. We're going straight into novel economy, which is a nice way of saying things are tough on that front. And it's going to be a novel election. So to look at it, let's go backwards for just a moment and then we'll go forwards. In terms of 2018, it's kind of been alluded to here. Democrats had big wins in the US House and in the governor's races then. That was a great big deal. Democrats were super happy. But I want to say at the legislative level in 2018, Democrats made gains, but they were really very modest gains. And the big story from then, I'll go ahead to the next slide, was that women made gains as candidates. And you can see we got over the 25% mark for the first time ever in 2018. So that means 1/4 of the 7,383 legislators are women at this point going in. Will that be a further uptick? I don't really know. Let's go to the next slide then. So next we've got, where are we now in terms of party control? And this is after the 2018 election and also the 2019 election. So what we've got that stands out for me on this is that there's only one state where the legislature has the chambers held by different parties, and that's Minnesota. And this is really unusual. You have to go back 100 years to have this much unity, either unity on the blue side or unity on the red side. Let's go to the next slide and we'll look at what this means for control. So you learned a little bit from Jessica about the governors. When you add in governors and you get the governor, you get the Senate, you get the House, if they're all of the same party, then it's blue or it's red. And if any of those three are different from the other two, then it's orange on this. And you can see a whole lot more orange here than you did on the previous slide. And what that says to me is that governors, some of whom were elected in 2018, came in as Ds in states with Republican legislatures. So it's been an interesting year for NCSL, who cares about legislative power. How is legislative power and executive branch power shared? And then particularly with coronavirus, it was governors who were out front. There was no doubt about it. Governors had to take the lead in emergency actions. Okay, next slide then. So all of the states that are colored yellow here will have state elections this year. We know, of course, that all states have the presidential election and the federal elections, but 44 states have state elections. And I've popped in those little asterisks to show where the governors are up as well as the legislatures. And I don't expect anybody to be able to follow all of that. So my first suggestion is follow your state, and then let's go to the next slide. My second suggestion is look at battleground states. These may not be the exact same ones we talked about earlier. I see I've got Florida on here, and that wasn't what we heard about earlier, but just go with it. And I put a question mark on Texas. I was working off of some 538 data, and it seemed like it was within some possibility. I just couldn't color it as a swing state. It just didn't seem that way. So I put the question mark. So if you look at what those swing states are at the presidential level, let's go to the next slide. There's a fair amount of overlap with the elections that are likely to change chambers. And Megan, we can go to the next slide now. A lot of, now what I've got is the stars mean where it could be a presidential swing state, and no, I got that backwards. I think I screwed that up. Shoot. Okay, what I want, my point here for this slide for everyone is that where chambers are possibly going to flip are the very same states in general where the president could be a battleground state. So it's not probably a surprise. And I kept the question mark here on Texas. I've done this presentation twice before. Both times Texans stopped me and they said, why don't you have Texas colored? And so I put the question mark. That's based on sort of internal Texas view of it, as opposed to any data that I got from other sources. So I'm happy to go through this state by state and tell you what I'm thinking, but let's not. I can come back if anybody really wants to know about it. Let's talk about reapportionment. And if you go ahead and push the next button, we'll see the one animation I put in here. So the states that are kind of peach colored on my screen are projected to lose a seat in Congress this coming year. And the states that are that violent yellow are projected to win a state. And this is shifting. There's a lot of stuff going on with the census, and when will reapportionment data be submitted, and what data will be submitted to Congress to get this figured out. So it is possible that this could change, but this is what was projected with what I'm going to call the normal expectation for reapportionment. Check back with me if you want the details on what's going on with the census. Let's go to the next slide. One of the reasons this election really matters is not only because that mayor in the White House will be determined, but also that the people who will be doing redistricting throughout the nation are mostly elected in the year 2020. So that makes it a great big year for us. I'd even say this is the biggest year in 20 for an election, because you do have the president and the census data coming out, and therefore the redistrictors. So you put that together, biggest election in 20 years. Next slide. These were my thoughts about what might be coming. If you're a Democrat, you can't take glory in the fact that our economy is a mess, but it makes it harder for the Republicans to run on it. There's money and enthusiasm on their side, and they think they have Trump as a card to play because people might not be a fan of him. On the GOP side, they have large majorities in legislatures right now, and those majorities are large enough, it's hard to pull them back down. 2016 was the high water mark. 2018, they lost a little bit. They could still lose some more and still by far maintain control in legislatures around the nation. GOP in general has favorable districts to run on. There's a few places, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, where they're running on different lines than they did in 2018, could have a different response. And of course, Trump is a huge draw for GOP. Next slide. This is just about election administration. Never before have reporters cared about what's going on with election administration like they do this year. It's always been about the horse race. And this year it's not. It's about how are we going to run this election. Happy to talk about that if anybody wants to talk about that, but I just threw that in and now I'm done. Megan, let's go to the questions.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was like a lightning round version of your presentation. But again, thanks so much to all of our speakers for kind of touching on a whole lot of great information. Again, we covered a lot of ground. We got into the weeds in a couple spots, but again, really wanted to give each of them a chance to kind of set the stage, set the context for what might be ahead in 2020 in terms of what might be the outcome of the elections. So now I'd really love to get into kind of what might be the impact of the election. So I'd actually love to turn to John first. John, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about, based on your perspective, kind of what you see as the impact of the federal elections on education and training policy in general, and particularly CTE, to the extent that you can speak to that. So we'll start with John.
Sure. Thanks, Megan. You know, if we're projecting an all Democratic Congress and administration, there are a couple of key members who will have a tremendous impact on CTE and other education and training programs. Number one is Patty Murray of the Senate. Right now, she's ranking member of the Health Committee, as well as ranking member of the Labor HHS Appropriations Subcommittee, and a strong supporter of CTE, the author of WIOA, for example, and many other education and training related bills. She would become the chair of the Health Committee, in charge of a whole host of authorizations, whether it's WIOA reauthorization, apprenticeships, finding a way to help community colleges more effectively, and childcare. Her childcare and education bill is $430 billion that she introduced last month, and includes $1 billion for career and technical education. And she also introduced the Senate version of Relaunching America's Workforce Act, RAWA, which would include an additional $1 billion for CTE. So having Senator Murray in that role is going to be extraordinarily important and quite impactful for our community. As well, Rosa DeLauro is running for full committee chair in the House. She's currently chair of the Labor, HHS, and Education Appropriations Subcommittee. Another huge fan and great supporter of education training, CTE programs. So if she becomes full committee chair, and it's a three-way race right now, she would most likely keep Labor HHS as well. So she would be in charge of actually divvying up how much funding would go to each subcommittee. And we would expect there would be a robust allocation to Labor HHS, and that would be good news as well. And lastly, Bobby Scott on the Education and Labor Committee in the House, who's the author of RAWA, would then have partners to work with on the Senate side to really push legislation through in a way that's been challenging for Democrats in the minority. All those things are pointed in the right direction for CTE, particularly on the funding side. There is one caveat, that there won't be 60 Democratic senators. The filibuster will stay in place because it takes 2/3 of members to actually vote to remove a rule of the Senate, and they're not going to get 67 voters to overturn this filibuster, most likely. So it will still have to be a bipartisan effort in the Senate, but the Democrats will be in charge of the agenda, and that is a huge asset for them, indeed, if they take over the majority. So that's where, on that congressional level, I'll stop now, and please have the colleagues join in on other areas as well.
Jessica, anything you wanted to add based on your perspective?
No, I mean, I think John covered a lot of that. I think just, again, the thing to watch, I will just underscore with the Senate, is whether this check and balance argument is one that we began to see Republicans make later on. Certainly, we sort of saw this happen in 1996, actually, when it certainly looked like Bill Clinton was going to win re-election, and we saw Republicans sort of begin to sort of make an argument that you need to have a Republican Senate to sort of be a check and balance. And conversely, we can sometimes see in 2016 that perhaps some of the votes were because they felt like that Hillary Clinton was going to be the be the president, and so you even, I think, saw more Republican votes down ballot necessarily. But at this time, if Biden's lead sort of holds, I think is the most important thing we're watching. Do we sort of see? It's very hard right now, I think, for Republicans to distance themselves from this president because he is not a party stalwart in any way. You know, a sort of team player in the way that Bob Dole was in 1996. And that, because again, if you criticize him, if you try to distance yourself, then you're going to get a tweet, you're going to get sort of his angry supporters against you in that way. But is that sort of thing that could sort of stymie some of this if you do still hold on to a Republican Senate very narrowly? I will say our projections are largely based on the data we have as of now. That doesn't mean that the data could not change from now until Election Day, certainly.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Wendy, I know the world of CTE, thank you for being willing to share with us that CTE is not something you knew about beforehand. I'm glad that, you know, us inviting you gave you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about CTE. So based on the information that I know you got from some of your colleagues, what do you see as the impact of elections on CTE policy, particularly at the state level?
Well, of course, everything is unique to the state, and I'm fairly sure the people on the call know what's likely to happen in their state. It might be fun to see what they expect might be the case for them. I mean, overall, I've given you this picture that there could be a little shift perhaps to the Democratic side. All of those chambers that might flip would be flipping from Republican to Democratic. What does that mean? I had no idea. So I asked Michelle Ekstrom, our director of, and here's what she said. She said the outcome of state elections won't change the course of CTE policy very much because ever since the Great Recession, legislators of both parties have seen education as an economic engine. They've cared more about career readiness than college readiness. Then she went on and told me some more things, but the point was that she doesn't see it at this stage as Democrats versus Republicans. It's more like everybody's on board and let's push forward. And then she said, what with the coronavirus, that has, of course, hit state economies really hard. And that means that there would likely to be even more focus on career training for high school students and others. So her caveat then was that the focus may be there, but it's not at all clear what kinds of jobs would be needed, which you all probably know well. And that uncertainty is the watchword for this. Uncertainty about what jobs, what kinds of programs, but not about whether it's good. And then she ended by sending her best wishes to you all. So
thank you so much for conveying Michelle's thoughts with all of us. Really appreciate that. Wendy, I'd love to go back to you and dig in a little bit more deeply on a point that you touched on very briefly at the end of your presentation. I'd love to talk a little bit more on kind of the impact of redistricting. You know, you talked about kind of this being one of the most important elections truly in 20 years, just because of the lineup of the census with everything else. So tell us a little bit more about what's ahead with redistricting, and again, kind of through the lens of how this will affect federal funding to states.
Okay, so redistricting is the action of reestablishing the geographic areas from which our elected representatives are elected. It takes place after the census every 10 years, that's required. And the key goal here is that each of those geographic districts is of equal population. In any given state, they do both, well, in all the states that have more than one congressperson, they divvy up the state into geographic regions for the US House, and they also divvy up the state House and the state Senate districts. So they take the state and divide it 3 different ways. One's for the US House, one's for the state House, one's for the Senate. So there are literally millions of ways that this could be done if you're using a computer and you are just putting in some basic factors like getting to equal population, millions. So then there's a lot of other factors that come into play, many of which are political factors. What is good for incumbents? What is good for your party? What is good for communities of interest? So a lot of factors go into play, and the people who do redistricting, and in most of the nation it is legislators, although there are a growing number of states that are using commissions. But whoever's doing redistricting takes those factors into account and draws those districts. So if they're drawn in a way that is more favorable for one party or the other, then whatever the policy outcomes that that party prefers will come to the fore. So if you make districts that make it easier for Republicans to be elected or Democrats to be elected, then you end up with the chambers being held by that party, and they can decide which legislation comes forward. So I'm not suggesting that it's something that the general public can do a lot about. I'm just saying it's a big deal, and a lot of political energy in 2021 will be focused on redistricting and not so much on the other policy choices that states have before them.
Thanks, Wendy. That's a great preview. And again, I really appreciate the point that you ended on, that will sort of become a major focus in 2021. So I've seen a couple of questions come into the chat box. So I think we'll shift over to Q&A with our speakers. So again, just a reminder, if you have follow-up questions or anything that our speakers maybe didn't touch on that you're interested in getting their thoughts on, feel free to type those into the chat box. One question that came in from Liz Weldy was a question: what does the outlook look like for the realm of educational equity specifically? John, Jessica, Wendy, any initial thoughts that any of you want to share in response to that comment?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll start. What we're seeing from Democrats right now are a number of marker bills. I think the best evidence of this particular question is the Economic Justice Act that Senator Schumer introduced last week or the week before, which would provide $300 billion to hard-hit communities of color to try to deal with some of the systemic racism and injustices that have gone on. And it includes $25 billion for workforce development, including $1 billion for CTE. That bill's not going to pass in the current Congress, but it's a marker for the future and what could easily come up as a significant bill in early next year. As well, there's, I think there's going to be a much greater focus on domestic investment and trying to help communities that have faced such systemic challenges. And so when we're thinking about CTE and the next Congress, we have to keep in mind that we would expect an all-Democratic Congress would focus on not only the Economic Justice Act, but certainly a component of RAWA will be pushed, if not to $15 billion. There is Senator Murray's real interest in childcare and education as a whole, in which we play a role within it, as well as WIOA reauthorization, registered apprenticeships, other authorizations that have been stuck and will begin to move more easily in a one-party environment. So I think there is a combination of trying to deal with the inequities, societal inequities, as well as trying to deal with some of the education and training issues and trying to address high levels of unemployment, which CBO expects is going to be, over the course of the next decade, we'll have higher unemployment than we had pre-pandemic levels. So our work in career pathways is going to be that much more important moving forward.
Thanks so much, John. Wendy, Jessica, anything else to add in response to that question about the impact on educational equity?
I think that one thing that we are just seeing, from a political standpoint of trying to, depending upon what the makeup looks like, is that we have seen, when I look back at the 2018 elections, a lot of those moderate Democrats lost in the Senate. Someone like Claire McCaskill, Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Donnelly, that were more likely to work across party lines. Joe Manchin sort of remains one of the last people there. And some of these more Republican centrists could be voted out too. And we'll have to, one thing we are kind of watching too is what kind of Democrats are replacing them. In some instances, I think they probably would be more moderate. Cal Cunningham in North Carolina, for instance. But what we are seeing is just that there's very little incentive to have centrists that are elected anymore. And I think that could have just an impact on what gets passed and what people are able to work together on things as well legislatively.
Megan, I don't have much to offer here, but what I can say is that I'm the mother of a high school teacher, and I read the newspaper and try to stay up to date. And it looks to me like equity is not only brought to our attention through what's on the front page of the paper this summer, but also every single article that I see about education seems to talk about this. And it's often spoken of in context of broadband access, which is we now know that broadband is not everywhere, and it's a real hardship when you see people sitting outside the McDonald's so that they can get internet connection. And then Megan, it's possible your organization has some thoughts about this too that we don't have.
Yeah, we definitely have done a lot of work in the space of educational equity, and certainly our members know about our resources in this area. But we can definitely follow up with folks on that one. Any other questions coming in for our speakers? Sarah, did I miss any other questions that came in?
You've got them all.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it doesn't look like any other questions are coming in, so we will go ahead and wrap up our webinar just a few minutes early. Thank you again for joining us today. This was a very timely presentation, covered a lot of really valuable content. Again, huge thanks to our speakers, John, Jessica, and Wendy. I think Sarah will be popping up a very short evaluation for you to share your reflections with us. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.